The wrench slipped, and Elias Vance caught it before it hit the floor. His fingers closing around the cold metal, the way they always did, fast, sure, and without thinking. He was lying on his back beneath a Valthari cargo loader, a machine that weighed more than a small building and smelled like burnt copper and something alive, something organic that he had never quite gotten used to, even after 2 years on this station. Station Korath 9 sat on the edge of nowhere, a military outpost built into an asteroid the size of a small moon. And it belonged to the Valthari Dominion, an empire of creatures that stood 7 feet tall, wore shells of natural armor over their scaled and insectoid bodies, and looked at humans the way humans might look at mice that had somehow learned to hold tools. They called humans soft ones, and they were not wrong about that. Eli wiped the bioluminescent grease from his hands onto his already ruined jumpsuit and rolled out from under the loader, squinting up at the harsh blue light of the maintenance bay, the lowest and dirtiest section of the station, where broken things came to either be fixed or forgotten. He was one of 9 humans aboard Korath 9, all of them laborers, all of them stuck here under contract because the pay was better than anything Earth could offer, and because the galaxy did not have many places for a species that had only figured out faster-than-light travel 30 years ago. The other humans kept to themselves mostly, eating together in the corner of the mess hall, sleeping in the smallest quarters on the station, trying not to draw attention. And Eli understood that instinct, because drawing attention on a Valthari station usually meant drawing trouble. But Eli had a problem. He could not stop fixing things. It was not bravery or ambition. It was something deeper than that, something in the way his brain was wired, something that made him look at a broken machine, feel a pull in his chest like a doctor seeing a wound, and he simply could not walk away from it. 3 Valthari engineers had declared the cargo loader dead that morning, its drive coil shattered beyond repair according to their diagnostics, and they had marked it for scrap and moved on, because that was how the Valthari worked. If the manual said it was dead, then it was dead. Eli had looked at the drive coil and seen something different. He had seen the way the fracture lines followed the energy pathways, had understood that the coil was not shattered, but dislocated, its core still intact, but shifted out of alignment by a fraction of a millimeter, and he had known, the way he always knew, that he could fix it. So he had fixed it, using a welding torch that was meant for hull patches, a tube of sealant he had stolen from a supply closet, and a piece of his own belt buckle ground down to the exact thickness he needed as a shim. The loader hummed to life. The sound was clean and strong, and the 3 Valthari engineers stared at him with their multifaceted eyes and said nothing at all. A low-caste Valthari worker named Dren, who sometimes shared food with Eli in the maintenance bay, clicked his mandibles in what passed for a laugh. "You make them angry when you do that, soft one," Dren said, his translator turning his chittering speech into flat mechanical English. "I make them angry when I breathe," Eli replied, and Dren clicked again, because it was true. Eli gathered his tools and moved on to the next job, because there was always a next job, always something leaking or sparking or grinding itself to pieces. And the station never stopped needing him, even if it never admitted it. He was halfway through rewiring a ventilation node when the alarms began. Not the small alarms that meant a pressure leak or a waste system backup. The deep ones, the ones that vibrated through the metal bones of the station, made every living thing aboard stop and listen. Eli pulled himself out of the ventilation shaft and made his way to the nearest viewport, pushing through a crowd of Valthari workers who barely noticed him because they were all staring at the same thing. Ships were coming out of faster-than-light travel, dropping into real space like wounded animals, and Eli had seen enough damaged vessels in his years with the Earth Navy to know that these ships were in terrible shape. There were dozens of them, Valthari warships, massive and organic-looking, with their biometallic hulls that grew and healed like living skin. Except these hulls were not healing. They were bleeding, leaking bioluminescent fluid into the vacuum in long, glowing trails that looked like the blood of gods. Dark veins crawled across the surfaces of the ships, black and pulsing, and Eli recognized corruption when he saw it, even if he did not know its name yet. "The Queen's fleet," Dren whispered beside him, and there was something in his voice that Eli had never heard from a Valthari before. Fear. "What happened to them?" Eli asked. "The Nethkari," Dren said, and the name came out like a curse. "They are parasites, corruptors. They have weapons that poison our biometal, that turn our own shiks against us, and it seems they have found the Queen." "Which Queen?" "Vyrathra Zel-Korath," Dren said, and now every Valthari within earshot straightened at the name. "She commands the Western Warfleet. She has conquered 11 star systems. She has never retreated from any battle in her life, and she is coming here because she has nowhere else to go." The station erupted into controlled chaos after that. Officers shouting orders, engineers running to prep repair bays, soldiers forming honor guards, because even in disaster, the Valthari respected their rituals and hierarchies. Eli went back to his ventilation node because nobody had told him to do anything else, and because he figured a working ventilation system would matter more than ever, with a whole fleet's worth of wounded warriors about to come aboard. He was wrong about being forgotten. A Valthari officer, tall, scarred, with the rank markings of a sub-commander on her chest plate, stormed into the scrap bay 20 minutes later, with a squad of soldiers behind her and fire in her compound eyes. "Every hand," she barked, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "Every worker, every engineer, every creature on this station that can hold a tool, you are conscripted for emergency fleet repair by order of Queen Vyrathra. Failure to comply is treason against the Dominion." Her eyes swept the bay and landed on Eli, small, soft, covered in grease, holding a human-made wrench in his alien-made world. "Even you, soft one," she said, and the contempt in her voice was sharp enough to draw blood. "You can carry tools." Eli set down his wrench and picked up his toolbox and followed the soldiers out of the only home he had known for 2 years, walking toward the upper decks where the Queen's wounded fleet was bleeding and dying and waiting for hands that could help. He did not know yet that those hands would be his. He did not know that everything was about to change. He only knew that something was broken, and that was enough to make him walk toward it instead of away. Queen Vyrathra Zel-Korath walked onto Station Korath 9 like a storm given flesh, and every creature in her path moved aside, not because they were ordered to, but because something ancient in their blood told them to. She stood 7 feet and 4 inches tall without her armor, and nearly 8 feet with it, her body a fusion of insectoid and reptilian evolution, hard chitin plates over scaled skin, 4 eyes that burned amber like molten metal, and a jaw lined with teeth that could bite through steel cable. But it was the armor that drew every eye. Kael'thos, the living armor of House Zel-Korath, bonded to her bloodline for 12 generations, grown from biometallic seeds planted in the chest of the first queen who had ever worn it, fed on royal blood and neural energy until it became something more than metal and more than alive. It was dying. Eli saw it from across the docking bay, where he stood holding a crate of plasma cutters like every other. Conscripted worker, just another pair of hands in a crowd of hundreds. And even from that distance, he could see the sickness crawling through the armor's surface. Dark veins, black as void, pulsing with a slow and terrible rhythm, spread across the chest plate and down the left arm. And where they touched the biometal, the usual blue-white glow had turned gray and sick. The armor moved wrong, too, Eli noticed. The way a machine moves when its timing is off by just a fraction. Not enough for most people to see, but enough for someone who had spent his whole life listening to the language of broken things. Virathra walked with her head high and her eyes burning, but Eli could see the tension in her shoulders, could see the micro-adjustments she made with every step to compensate for the armor's failing responses, and he understood in that moment that she was in pain and that she would die before she showed it. Sub-Commander Rekka, the same officer who had conscripted the Scrap Bay, flanked the Queen with a squad of royal guards, and together they swept through the station toward the Royal Engineering Wing where the biosmiths waited. Eli was assigned to carry equipment to that same wing, which was how he ended up standing in the corner of a room he had no business being in, watching the most important medical procedure he had ever seen. Old Torvis was the station's last biosmith, and he looked like he was barely holding himself together. His chiton was cracked and discolored from radiation sickness. His hands trembled when he raised them, and his eyes had the cloudy look of someone who was measuring his remaining days in single digits. But when he placed his palms on Kael'thas and closed his eyes, his voice was steady and sure and sad. "The corruption has reached the heart node, my queen," Torvis said, and the room went silent in a way that felt like gravity doubling. The Nethkari lance was designed for this. It did not just damage the outer structure, it planted a seed of corruption deep in the core, and that seed has been growing since the battle. "How long?" Virathra asked, and her voice was controlled, but Eli could hear the edge beneath it, like a blade hidden in silk. 2 cycles, Torvis said, perhaps less. The corruption is accelerating, feeding on the armor's own energy to spread itself further. And when it reaches full saturation, the heart node will fail, and Kael'thas will die. Then cut it out. I cannot, my queen. The corruption has woven itself through the primary energy pathways, and to excise it, I would need to disconnect and reconnect the heart node's main conduits with a precision that my hands can no longer provide. Torvis raised his trembling fingers. I am sorry. 20 years ago I could have done it. 10 years ago perhaps. But now the radiation has taken what the years did not, and I will not risk killing Kael'thas with a slip of my... Virathra stood very still and said nothing for a long time, and in that silence Eli could feel the weight of 12 generations pressing down on the room. Kael'thas was not just armor, it was legacy, identity, a living connection to every queen who had come before, and losing it would be like losing a piece of her own soul. Eli should have stayed quiet. He knew he should have stayed quiet, knew it the way he knew that touching a live wire was a bad idea. But he was looking at the diagnostic screen over Torvis's shoulder, and his brain was doing what it always did, seeing patterns, making connections, translating the alien data into something that made mechanical sense. The corruption spread was not random. It followed the energy pathways exactly the way a cascading feedback loop followed power conduits in an old Earth Navy reactor. He had seen it before, had fixed it before, had spent 3 days inside the engine room of the destroyer ESS Callaway rerouting power to isolate a runaway cascade that everyone else said would require a full reactor replacement. You could bypass it, Eli said, and the words came out before he could stop them, quiet but clear in the silent room. Every eye turned to him. Compound eyes, amber eyes, the clouded eyes of a dying biosmith, and Eli felt his stomach drop the way it did when a machine slipped off a jack. "What did you say?" Rekka hissed, stepping forward with her hand on her sidearm. "You dare speak in the Queen's presence, soft one? You are here to carry tools, not to—" "Let him speak," Torvis said, and his voice had a strange quality to it, something between curiosity and desperate hope. Eli swallowed hard and stepped forward, his heart hammering against his ribs. "The corruption follows the energy pathways," he said, pointing at the diagnostic screen. "It is using them like roads, traveling along the paths of least resistance toward the heart node. But if you reroute the energy through secondary pathways first, and then isolate the corrupted sections, the corruption loses its power source, and the spread stops. And then you can cut out the dead sections and reconnect the clean pathways around them. He grabbed a piece of carbon chalk from a tool tray and knelt on the floor, sketching as he talked, lines and nodes and bypass routes that mixed what he knew about human engineering with what he could see on the Valthari diagnostics. It is like a river, he said, drawing faster. If you cannot stop the poison in the water, then you build new channels around it. You let the clean water flow through the new channels, and then you drain the poison section and fill it in. Torvis stared at the floor, and then at Eli, and then at the floor again. And something changed in his old clouded eyes. A light, faint, but real. This is not biosmithing, Torvis said slowly. No, Eli agreed. It is plumbing. But the principle is the same. Torvis made a sound that might have been a laugh, or might have been a sob, and then he looked at the Queen. My Queen, I cannot perform this procedure alone. My hands will not allow it. But if this human's theory is correct, and I believe it may be, then I could guide his hands to do what mine cannot. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Eli had ever heard. Virathra turned her full attention on him for the first time, and being seen by her was like standing in front of a furnace, heat of her gaze on his skin. You are a mechanic, she said, and it was not a question. Yes, Your Majesty. You repair cargo loaders and ventilation systems, and the small broken things that my warriors discard. Yes, Your Majesty. And you believe you can touch what 12 generations of queens have worn? Eli looked at the diagnostic screen, where the dark veins of corruption pulsed like a slow heartbeat, counting down to 0. And then he looked back at the Queen, this towering, terrifying, magnificent creature who was watching her oldest companion die and could do nothing about it. I believe your armor does not want to die, Your Majesty, he said, and his voice was steady, even though his hands were shaking. And neither do I. Virathra studied him for a long moment that stretched like wire being pulled to its breaking point. If you kill Kael'thas, she said finally, her voice low and precise, I will wear your bones as decoration. Understood, Your Majesty. Then begin. The Queen's private armory smelled like old lightning and warm blood, and in the blue-white glow of Kael'thas mounted on its stand, Eli could see every vein of corruption crawling through the living metal, like dark roots burrowing through sacred ground. He stood before the armor, with his tools laid out on a cloth, human tools, crude and simple, compared to the elegant instruments of a Valthari biosmith. But they were his, and he knew them the way a musician knows the strings of an instrument they have played for 20 years. Torvis sat beside him in a chair, because the old biosmith could no longer stand for more than a few minutes, his body wrecked by the radiation that had been eating him alive for the past 3 years. But his mind was sharp, and his voice was clear, and that was all Eli needed. Place your hands on the chest plate, Torvis instructed, slowly. Kael'thas will read your intent before it reads your touch. Eli pressed his palms flat against the plate. Biometal? And gasped. It was warm. Not like heated metal, but like skin, like something with a pulse. And beneath his fingers he could feel a vibration that rose and fell in a rhythm that was unmistakably a heartbeat. It is alive, Eli whispered. More alive than you know, Torvis said. Kael'thas is semi-sentient. It thinks, it feels, it remembers every queen who has ever worn it. And right now it is afraid because it can feel itself dying, and it does not understand why. The armor pulsed beneath Eli's hands, and then pain. Sharp, electric, searing pain that shot up through his palms and into his wrists. As the living metal rejected him, recognized him as foreign, as wrong, as not Valthari, and the biometalax surface beneath his skin rippled and pushed back. Blisters rose on his palms almost instantly, red and angry, and Eli hissed through his teeth, but did not pull away. "It is rejecting you," Torvis said, watching carefully. "No. Most biosmiths would withdraw and attempt a bonding ritual to ease the—" "I am not a biosmith," Eli said, and then he did something that made Torvis go very still. He started talking to the armor. Not in any formal way, not with ritual words or ancient phrases, but the way he talked to every machine he had ever fixed, low and steady and honest, a murmur that came from somewhere deep in his chest. "Hey," he said softly, his burnt hands still pressed flat against the dying metal, "I know you do not know me. I know I am not what you are used to, but I am here to help, and I need you to let me in, not because I deserve it, but because you are running out of time, and I am the only one in this room whose hands are steady enough to do what needs to be done." The armor pulsed once, twice, and the burning under his palms faded from agony to heat to warmth. Torvis let out a breath he had been holding for what seemed like a very long time. "Is listening," the old biosmith said, and there was wonder in his ruined voice. The work began. Torvis guided, and Eli executed, and together they spoke a language that had never existed before, half biosmithing and half mechanical engineering, half ancient tradition and half human improvisation. "The primary energy conduit runs from the heart node along the spine of the chest plate," Torvis explained, his clawed finger tracing the path on a diagnostic screen. "You must disconnect it here and here, reroute the flow through the secondary lattice on the left side, and then isolate the corrupted section so it loses power." Eli translated the biology into mechanics in his head. The conduit was a power line, the heart node was a reactor, the corruption was a feedback loop, and the secondary lattice was a backup circuit that had never been designed to carry the full load, but could handle it if he reinforced the junctions. He worked with his hands, inside the building. Living body of the armor, his fingers moving through biometallic tissue that pulsed and shifted around him, warm and wet and responsive in a way that no machine he had ever touched had been. Hour 1 passed, and he rerouted the first energy pathway, feeling the armor shudder as the flow changed direction, like a river finding a new course. Hour 3, and the secondary lattice was reinforced with microwelds that Torvis watched with wide, clouded eyes, because no biosmith had ever thought to strengthen living metal from the inside, the way an engineer reinforces a load-bearing wall. Hour 6, and Eli's hands were bleeding where the biometal had cut him during a spasm of pain, the corruption fighting back, sensing that it was being starved. But he wrapped his fingers in strips torn from his own shirt and kept working. Hour 9, and Torvis had to talk him through a crisis when the heart node flickered and nearly went dark, the armor's heartbeat stuttering like a dying engine, and Eli held perfectly still, with his hands deep inside the chest cavity, and whispered, come on, stay with me," until the rhythm steadied. Hour 11, and the corruption was isolated, a dark mass of dead metal and parasitic energy cut off from the rest of the armor like a tumor waiting to be removed. Hour 12, and Eli picked up the finest cutting tool he had, a modified laser scalpel he had built himself from salvaged parts, and positioned it at the edge of the heart node, where corruption met clean metal. "This is the moment," Torvis said, and his voice was barely above a whisper. "One cut. If you go too deep, you sever the heart node's primary bond, and Kael'thas dies. If you go too shallow, you leave corruption behind, and it regrows within days." Eli looked at his hands, human hands, small and soft by galactic standards, bleeding through makeshift bandages, blistered and burned by alien metal that had tried to reject him for 12 straight hours. His hands did not tremble. He cut. The scalpel moved through the boundary between corruption and clean metal with a precision that made old Torvis weep, actual tears rolling down his cracked and weathered face, because in 50 years of biosmithing he had never seen a steadier hand. The corrupted mass came free, and Eli pulled it out and dropped it on the floor where it hissed and died like a living thing denied its host. He reconnected the energy pathways, not the way they had been before, but better, using the reinforced secondary lattice as a new primary route that was shorter and more efficient, with built-in redundancies that meant the armor could reroute around damage automatically in the future. Hour 13, and Kael'thas began to glow. Not the sick gray glow of the last few days, but a deep, rich blue-white that filled the room like sunrise, and the armor's heartbeat under Eli's palms was strong and steady and fast, waking up from a long nightmare into a morning it had not expected to see. But something else was happening too. The new pathways Eli had built were interacting with the armor's living systems in ways he had not predicted, and the biometal was adapting to his modifications, integrating them, making them part of itself, and in the process developing a resistance to the Nethkari corruption pattern that no Valthari biosmith had ever achieved. Impossible, Torvis breathed, staring at the diagnostic screen. The armor it has learned from your repair. It has built antibodies against the corruption using your pathway design as a template. Eli sat back on the floor, shaking with exhaustion, his hands ruined and his vision blurred, and his heart pounding, so hard he could hear it in his ears. "So it is going to be okay?" he asked. Torvis smiled, a real smile, wide and full and peaceful, in a way that Eli understood meant the old biosmith had been waiting for this moment before he allowed himself to let go. "Better than okay," Torvis said. "You have not just healed Kael'thas, you have made her stronger than she has been in generations." Torvis placed one trembling clawed hand on Eli's shoulder and squeezed with what little strength he had left. "You have hands like a biosmith, soft one," Torvis said. "No, better. A biosmith respects tradition, but you respect the machine itself, and that is something I wish I had learned 50 years ago." Torvis died 4 hours later, quietly, in his chair in the armory, still smiling. Eli was alone with the glowing armor when the doors opened and Queen Vyrathra Zelkorath walked in. She stopped. She stared at Kael'thas, her companion, her inheritance, blazing with light and life, and a strength that she could feel even from across the room, like heat from a bonfire. She stood in silence for a very long time, rolled through the chamber like distant thunder. "Who repaired my armor?" The room was silent. The guards, the attendants, the engineers who had gathered in the corridor, all of them frozen and mute. Eli was still on the floor, kneeling in a pool of bioluminescent fluid and his own blood, barely conscious, his bandaged hands resting on his knees. He raised one ruined hand. "I did, Your Majesty." The silence after Eli spoke lasted exactly 4 heartbeats, and in those 4 heartbeats he watched the Queen's face cycle through emotions that he suspected very few living beings had ever seen on the face of Vyrathra Zelkorath. Shock first, genuine and unguarded, her amber eyes widening as they moved from the glowing armor to the small broken human kneeling on her floor. Then something that looked like anger, hot and instinctive, because a creature that was not Valthari had laid hands on the most sacred object in her bloodline, without ritual or permission or precedent. And then, and this was the one that made Eli's breath catch, something quieter, something that lived beneath the fury and the pride, something that looked almost like gratitude, fighting its way through 12 generations of tradition that said it should not exist. Vyrathra said nothing to him. She walked past him to the armor stand and placed her palm against Kael'thas, the way a mother might touch the face of a child she had feared was lost. And Eli saw the armor respond to her, glowing brighter, pulsing faster, reaching for its queen with a warmth that was unmistakable, even to a human who had only known it for 14 hours. Whatever she felt through that bond, it changed something in her eyes when she finally turned back to look at him. "Take him to the medical bay," she said to her guards, and her voice betrayed nothing. "The Royal Medical Bay. And if I hear that anyone has treated him as anything less than a patient of the crown, I will know about it." The guards exchanged glances, but they obeyed, because they always obeyed, and two of them lifted Eli to his feet with a gentleness that surprised him, and carried him out of the armory, while his vision swam, and his hands throbbed, and the last thing he saw before the doors closed was the Queen standing alone with her armor, her forehead pressed against the chestplate, her eyes closed. Political storm broke the next morning. Sub-Commander Rekka stood before the Queen in the War Council chamber, with fury radiating from every inch of her armored body, and she made her case with the precision of a soldier who believed absolutely in what she was saying. "He committed sacrilege. My Queen, the right of touching has governed the care of royal armor for 900 years, and it requires a bonded biosmith of verified bloodline, 3 days of purification ritual, and the spoken permission of the armor's living spirit. This human did none of these things. He is not biosmith, he is not Valthari, he is not even a citizen of the Dominion, and what he did cannot be allowed to stand without consequence." Several traditionalist officers murmured their agreement, and Rekka pressed forward. If word spreads that a soft one, a tool carrier from the scrap bay, was permitted to touch Kael'thas without punishment, every biosmith in the Dominion will see it as an insult to their craft. Every noble house will question the sanctity of their own armor bonds, and our enemies will see it as weakness. Vyrathra let her finish, and then she stood up from her throne and the room went dead silent. "Rekka," the Queen said, "I will ask you a question, and I want you to answer it honestly. Always, my Queen. When the Nethkari lance struck me in battle, and the corruption began to spread through Kael'thas, how many biosmiths aboard this station could have saved my armor?" Rekka hesitated, and that hesitation was the answer. "Torvus could not do it," Vyrathra continued. "His hands were dying with the rest of him. No other biosmith on this station had the skill, and the nearest Dominion bioforge is 11 days away at maximum speed, which means that Kael'thas had 2 days to live, and the only hands in this entire sector of space that could save it belonged to a human mechanic from the scrap bay." She paused and let that truth fill the room like cold water. "I am a pragmatist, Rekka. I honor our traditions because they have kept us strong for 1,000 years, but I will not let tradition kill the things I love when a better way exists." She turned to the full council. "The human Elias Vance is hereby declared Kael'thor bound, keeper of Kael'thas, protector of its systems, granted the personal protection of House Zel-Korath, and elevated above station labor rank to royal engineering status." The room erupted in protests, and Vyrathra let them burn for exactly 5 seconds before she raised one clawed hand, and silence fell like a hammer. "This is not a debate." Eli learned about his new title from a Valthari nurse, who told him with visible discomfort that he was being moved to the Royal Engineering Wing, and that his quarters would now be 4 times the size of his old bunk, and that he would have access to the Queen's personal workshop and tool stores. He did not know what to say, so he said "thank you," and the nurse looked at him like he had spoken a foreign language, which in a way he supposed he had, because Valthari did not thank people for following orders. The royal workshop was a cathedral of engineering. Eli walked through its doors for the first time, on legs that were still shaky from exhaustion, and he stopped and stared, and for a moment he forgot about his bandaged hands, and his bruised ribs, and the fact that half the station wanted him executed. Tools he had never seen before lined the walls. Instruments designed for working with living metal, devices that could read the electromagnetic heartbeat of biomechanical systems, fabricators that could grow replacement parts from seed metal cultures. He touched a diagnostic scanner, and it hummed to life under his fingers, and showed him the internal structure of the workbench itself. Every molecule, every energy pathway, every microfracture, and he laughed out loud. because it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He got to work immediately, because that was what Eli did. He worked. He studied the intersection of human engineering and Valthari biotech with a hunger that surprised even himself, reading everything Torvis had left behind, experimenting with hybrid techniques that combined mechanical reinforcement with biological adaptation, and slowly building an understanding of living metal that was different from anything the Valthari had ever developed. His innovations started small. A better way to seal microfractures in biometallic hull plating that was 3 times faster than the traditional method. A diagnostic algorithm that could predict corruption spread patterns before they became visible. A reinforcement technique for energy pathways that made them resistant to feedback loops. The Valthari engineers adopted his improvements quietly and without credit, because admitting that a human had taught them. Something was still a bridge too far, but Eli did not care about credit. He cared about the work. Virathra began visiting the workshop. The first time she came, she stood in the doorway for 10 minutes, watching him work before he noticed her. And when he jumped to his feet and stammered a greeting, she waved him back to his bench with an expression that might have been amusement. "Show me what you are doing," she said, and he did. She came back the next day, and the day after that, and each visit lasted longer than the last, and the questions she asked grew deeper and more searching. "Why do your kind build with dead metal?" she asked one evening, studying a human wrench with the same intensity she might give to a battle plan. "Because dead metal does what we tell it to," Eli said. "It does not have opinions. And that is a strength? It is a different kind of strength. Living metal adapts and grows and heals itself, which is incredible, but it also has moods and memories and fears, and sometimes those things get in the way of function. Dead metal is simple and reliable, and it does not panic when things go wrong." Virathra turned the wrench over in her massive clawed hand, and something shifted in her expression. "Your species lives such short lives," she said, and for once there was no contempt in the observation, only curiosity. 80 years at most, and you spend so many of those years building and fixing things that will outlast you. Why? Why not simply replace what is broken? Eli thought about that for a moment, wiping grease from his healing hands. "Because everything that is broken was once whole, Your Majesty," he said. "And it remembers. Somewhere in every broken machine there is a memory of what it was supposed to be. And when I fix it, I am not just restoring function. I am honoring that memory. I am saying that what it was matters enough to fight for." Virathra looked at him for a long time after that, and then she left without another word. And Eli went back to his work, wondering if he had said too much. The answer came 3 days later, when the intelligence reports hit the War Council like a bomb. The Nethkari ambush had not been random. It was a probing attack, a test of a new weapon. And the test had been successful enough that the Nethkari were now moving toward Korath 9, with a full invasion fleet. And they were bringing something called a corruption wave, a weapon that could broadcast the same parasitic signal that had nearly killed Kael'thas across an entire sector of space, disabling every piece of Valthari biometallic technology simultaneously, every ship, every suit of armor, every weapon, every shield. If it worked, the Queen's fleet would be dead in the void before a single shot was fired. Virathra called Eli to the War Council, the first human ever permitted to set foot in that room. And he stood among towering alien warriors who looked at him with emotions ranging from contempt to grudging curiosity. The Queen activated the tactical display, and the room filled with light, showing the approaching Nethkari fleet, vast and dark and terrible. "You fixed one suit of armor, human," Virathra said, her eyes burning into his. "Now I need you to fix my entire fleet." Eli looked at the display. Hundreds of ships, thousands of biometallic systems, an entire military infrastructure built on technology that was about to become its own worst enemy, and he took a deep breath. "I am going to need more tools," he said. And somewhere in the back of his mind, the same part that had looked at a broken cargo loader and seen a solution, the same part that had knelt before a dying alien armor and refused to accept the impossible, that part was already working. Eli slept 4 hours in 3 days, and even that was only because his body shut down without asking permission, dropping him unconscious at his workbench until Dren found him and dragged him to a cot that he did not remember lying down on and did not remember waking from. There was no time. The Nethkari fleet was 7 days out, and the corruption wave, that invisible plague designed to murder every piece of living technology in the Queen's fleet, was coming with it. And Eli had 7 days to solve a problem that the entire Valthari Dominion had never been able to solve. He did what he always did. He broke it down into pieces. The corruption wave was a signal, a broadcast frequency that resonated with the biometallic structure of Valthari technology, and turned its own living systems against it, like a virus encoded in sound. And the reason no one had ever found a defense was because the Valthari kept looking for a biological answer to a mechanical. Problem P. Eli looked for a mechanical answer instead. If the corruption wave was a signal, then it could be disrupted, dampened, scattered, the same way a noise-canceling system worked on Earth, by generating a counter-frequency that neutralized the incoming wave before it could reach its target. He designed the dampeners in 18 hours, sketching and calculating and testing and failing and trying again, with a stubbornness that made the Valthari engineers assigned to help him stare in open confusion, because they had never seen anyone fail so many times without stopping. The dampeners were ugly, chunky metal boxes wired into the biometallic infrastructure of each ship, with cables and brackets and connectors that looked like they belonged in a human garage rather than on a warship of the Dominion. The Valthari engineers hated them on sight. "These are abominations," said the lead engineer, a tall female named Sekthra, who had 3 combat decorations and 0 patience for human aesthetics. "You want us to bolt dead metal onto living ships? This is an insult." "This insult might save your fleet," Eli said, without looking up from his work. "It looks like something a Chal built from scrap." "Some of the best things I have ever fixed were held together with scrap," Eli said, and he handed her a welding tool. "Now are you going to help me, or are you going to stand there and critique my art?" Sekthra took the welding tool, and for a moment Eli thought she was going to throw it at his head. But instead, she let out a sharp clicking sound that he had learned to recognize as a Valthari grudging laugh, and she got to work. He trained them, all of them, every engineer on the station, in what he called human thinking, which was really just the art of seeing a problem from a direction that tradition had never considered. He taught them to look at their living ships the way he looked at machines, as systems of inputs and outputs, of energy flows and pressure points, of strengths that could be reinforced and weaknesses that could be routed around. Some of them resisted and some of them struggled, and some of them surprised him by understanding faster than he expected, and by the 3rd day he had teams working on every ship in the fleet, bolting his ugly dampeners into beautiful living warships while the biometal shivered and complained beneath their hands. The Valthari engineers started calling the dampeners the soft one's madness, and somehow the name became a badge of something that was not quite pride, but was at least the absence of contempt. On the 5th day, Virithra came to inspect the work. She walked through her flagship and looked at the dampeners bolted to the walls of her ship like barnacles on a whale, and she said nothing for a very long time. "Will it work?" she asked finally. "I do not know," Eli said, because he had promised himself he would never lie to her. She looked at him, and he saw something in her eyes that he recognized. The same look he had seen in the mirror of every ship he had ever served on before a battle. The look of someone who has done everything they can, and knows it might not be enough. "That is the most honest answer anyone has given me in 10 years, she said, and she put on Kael'thos and went to prepare her fleet for war. The Nethkari arrived on the 7th day. They came out of faster-than-light travel like a wound opening in the fabric of space. Hundreds of ships, dark and angular and wrong-looking, built from stolen and corrupted biometal that pulsed with a sickly red light. And at the center of the formation sat the flagship, massive and terrible, carrying the weapon that would end everything. Eli watched from the station's command center, where Virathra had ordered him stationed, surrounded by tactical displays and communication systems, and Valthari officers who no longer looked at him with contempt, because there was no room left for contempt. There was only the battle. The corruption wave fired. It was invisible and silent, and it moved at the speed of light, washing over the Valthari fleet like a tide of poison. And for one terrible, endless second, every biometallic system in every ship screamed. The lights flickered. The engines stuttered. The living metal of 100 warships shuddered and groaned as the wave tried to corrupt them from the inside out, tried to turn their own bodies against them, tried to do what it had been designed to do since the first Nethkari had looked at the Valthari and seen something beautiful that it wanted to destroy. And then the dampeners kicked in. Eli's ugly, crude, bolted-on boxes of dead metal and human engineering roared to life across the fleet, generating counter-frequencies that slammed into the corruption wave like a wall, breaking it, scattering it, turning the killing signal into noise. The ships held, not all of them perfectly. Some systems flickered, and some secondary arrays failed, and one destroyer on the far flank lost its port-side weapons grid for 3 agonizing minutes. But the fleet held. The living metal recovered. The corruption found no foothold, and the Nethkari's greatest weapon broke itself against the stubbornness of a human mechanic's jury-rigged solution. Eli heard the cheering through the communication channels, hundreds of Valthari voices roaring in triumph and relief, and he allowed himself exactly 2 seconds of pride before he got back to work, because the battle was not over. It was just beginning. Virathra led the counterattack, wearing Kael'thas like a second skin, her flagship surging forward into the Nethkari formation with a ferocity that made Eli's screens blur with the speed of it. And behind her came every ship in her fleet, alive and fighting and furious. Eli coordinated damage control from the station, directing repair crews across the fleet in real time, tracking every system failure and every dampener fluctuation, and improvising solutions on the fly the way he had done his entire life, talking to machines across the void, reading their pain through data streams, sending instructions that mixed Valthari biosmithing with human engineering into something new and desperate and effective. The battle raged for 6 hours, and it was bloody and costly and terrible, but the Valthari fought with the strength of a species that had been told it was going to die, and had chosen to disagree. In the final hour, the Nethkari flagship turned its weapon directly on Station Korath 9. The concentrated corruption beam hit the station's shields like a battering ram, and the shields buckled, and Eli watched the energy readings spike into ranges that the displays were not designed to show. He did not think about it. There was no time to think. He ran from the command center through corridors that were shaking themselves apart. Soldiers and workers and engineers who were bracing for impact, all the way down to the station's engineering core, where the main power systems lived. The corruption beam was overwhelming the shields, because the shields were biometallic, and the beam was designed to kill biometal. But the dampener network that Eli had installed throughout the station was still running, still generating counter-frequencies, still holding the corruption at bay inside the fleet. If he rerouted the station's core power through the dampener network, he could amplify the counter-frequency 1,000-fold and turn the station itself into a weapon, reflecting the corruption beam back at the source. It would work. It would also probably kill him, because the power overload would burn out every conduit in the network, and he was standing at the center of it. He grabbed the manual override controls and started rerouting. The power surged through the dampener network, and the station screamed, and Eli screamed with it, as electricity arced through the conduits around him, and the air turned white with discharge, and his hands, his scarred, healed, steady human hands, gripped the controls and held on. The counterpulse fired, the corruption beam reversed, the reflected wave slamming back across space into the Nethkari flagship, and the enemy vessel convulsed as its own weapon was turned against it, its stolen biometal corrupting and failing and dying from the inside out. The flagship cracked open like an egg and went dark, and the Nethkari fleet, leaderless, broken, and terrified by a weapon they did not understand, turned and ran. Eli did not see the victory. They found him in the engineering core, unconscious, his hands burned black from the energy discharge, his fingers still locked around the manual override controls in a grip so tight that the medical team had to pry them open one by one. He woke in the Royal Medical Bay. 3 days later, with his hands wrapped in biometallic healing grafts, and every bone in his body aching, and the first thing he saw was Queen Vyrathra Zelkarath standing at his bedside. She was not wearing Kael'thos. He had never seen her without the armor before. She was smaller, her natural chitin thinner and less imposing, her body showing scars and imperfections that the armor always hid, and Eli understood that she was showing him something that she showed almost no one. "Trust. My biosmiths say your hands will heal," she said, and her voice was softer than he had ever heard it. "They will be scarred, but functional." "That is all I need," Eli said. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that made his breath stop. "Kael'thos grieved when you were hurt. I felt it through the bond, felt the armor reach for you across the station, felt it cry out when your hands burned. My armor cares for you, Eli Vance, and in 12 generations. That has never happened with anyone who was not of my blood." She placed one massive clawed hand over his bandaged ones, gentle in a way that should have been impossible for something so powerful. "I name you Zelkorath bound," she said, "bound not to the armor alone, but to my house, to my name, to my bloodline's legacy. You are the first human to hold this honor, and I suspect you will not be the last, because your people have shown me something I did not believe was possible." "What is that, Your Majesty?" "That the softest hands in the galaxy," she said, "can hold the hardest things together." Word of what happened at Korath 9 spread across the galaxy in waves, through military channels and trade routes and whispered conversations in 100 ports on 100 worlds. The story changed in the telling the way stories always do, growing larger and stranger and more impossible with each retelling. But the core of it stayed the same, no matter who told it or in what language. A human mechanic, small and soft and short-lived, had knelt on the floor of an alien queen's armory and saved something sacred, with nothing but his hands and his stubborn refusal to let broken things stay broken. He had turned the enemy's greatest weapon into their destruction, using tools that looked like they belonged in a junkyard. He had held on when anyone else would have let go. On 100 worlds, in 100 languages, they told the story, and on those worlds, humans walked a little taller and spoke a little louder, and the creatures who had called them soft ones looked at them with new eyes and wondered what they had been missing. Because the galaxy had learned something it would not forget. The soft ones were not soft where it mattered. They were not fragile, they were flexible. They were not weak, they were willing. And when everything was broken, when the ancient and the sacred and the mighty had failed, when the universe itself seemed to be falling apart at the seams, it was a human who knelt beside it and whispered the most dangerous words any species had ever spoken. "I can fix this." And the most terrifying part, the part that made every other species in the galaxy look at humanity and feel something between admiration and fear. They meant it every single time.